Good morning, everyone. Hoping once again that everything is okay and the semester is moving along for all of you. Before I begin today's discussion, one more reminder, which I've already meant, of course, also on Monday. Your third quiz, the task for quiz number 3, is still online. And I remind you that the due date for this quiz is Sunday night. So make sure if you read the papers, to go into the link and answer the questions as instructed and submit that quiz by Sunday night. That's my announcement for today. Okay. Today we'll continue the discussion about territorial disputes. Quick reminder about the discussion on Monday. I talked about the importance of territorial disputes, the different explanations, whether we talk about proximity, interactions, and the important concept uh, provided by Vasquez regarding territoriality, mostly arguing that the issue of territory is very different than other issues, and that may lead to different types of behavior, and they increase the likelihood that states that have disputes about that specific issue will go into conflict. Then we talked about an issue-based approach, which views territory as one of the central issues when it comes to international relations overall and politics also. The concept of issue salience, the fact that different issues have both tangible and intangible values. When it comes to territory, that we saw that we have both tangible and intangible values. We'll talk about it a little bit more today. And the fact that when the higher issue salience for the territory has increased the likelihood that states are more willing to engage in conflict and invest more resources and accept higher costs because of the importance of that specific issue regarding territory. Then I talked about the work by Wright and Deal regarding the adding the domestic institution aspect into those questions of why do territorial disputes are more likely to escalate into wars, particularly the idea that between democracies and autocracies, there are differences in terms of how the leaders are going to behave facing this outbeating dynamic when the local or the domestic conversations around territorial issues tends to adopt a more aggressive approach. So it's going to make it much harder for leaders of democracy to ignore that. So they're less likely to compromise, they're more likely to go into conflict, and how that comes into play when they are interacting or they're facing disputes with a non-democracy and the results of their analysis. And then we talked about the diversionary theory of war, the idea behind leaders invoking a foreign policy crisis in order to divert public attention away from domestic problems. And the fact that most of the empirical evidence regarding that theory overall is mixed, but if we base this argument about trying to divert public attention away by focusing on territorial issues, and that's the argument made by Thier and other relevant scholars, because of the strong effect that territorial issues have, that is more likely to generate those dynamics when it comes to diverting public attention. And his analysis shows that to some level. So if you have any more questions about general discussion about territorial issues, territorial disputes, you're more likely, as always, to talk to me. Today, we keep talking about that. And as I said, on Monday, I talked about different importance of that issue, how leaders may use that. So we know already that territorial issues has the potential for having positive political effects for leaders because they are able to lead to rally the public around that issue and potentially support any kind of intervention abroad or military or sanctions or any kind of policy action. Now, another way that leaders are using territorial issues is to justify their actions when it comes to a conflict or an action that already began, and that's this "don't let them die in vain" argument, which is kind of a sunk cost argument. We've already gone into a conflict with that other rival over the territory. We have lost soldiers as part of this conflict, so we should keep going with it. This is an important issue. We should not let those soldiers die in vain over that much of that important issue, such as territory X. So we should have support from the public for this policy. So that's another kind of it's not really positive, but this is the potential benefits that leaders can gain from a political standpoint by using territorial issues. At the same time, I've also mentioned that when I talked about the work by Thier last on Monday, that there's potential risks, there are potential costs from going to conflict. I didn't give them the term that you have here, but this is the idea of culpability. leaders are viewed as culpable because they are responsible by going to conflict over territory, and they may suffer political costs because of it. They initiated the conflict over territory, whatever the motivation was, and they may suffer the conflict for that. And that's going to lead me to the discussion in the first part that I have today, kind of an introduction into this whole concept, and that talking about the cost that may emerge from a territorial conflict, the political cost that leaders may pay, even if they use all those kinds of arguments in order to justify going into conflict and using all those mechanisms or all those dynamics that I talked about, which makes it more likely that people will support territorial conflict. And that's going to be by looking at a recent work that is still not published, that's focusing on Israeli public opinion when it comes to the 1973 war, what's called the Yom Kippur War. This is increases the likelihood is going to be very, the results here will be more effective because the issue that the war was revolved around, or in many cases, was the territorial issues. So the issue is very salient for the public. There's a potential cost for reputation from losing political conflict. And one of the interesting aspects to think about when we're looking particularly on this conflict when it comes to Israeli public opinion is that this war has the potential to show the emergence of what's called adverse effects, because what are the potential negative political costs that the Israeli leaders have paid regarding this territorial wars, even though from a military perspective, Israel has won the war, right? So Israel, from a military strategy standpoint, has won the war and led to the Egyptian and the Syrians asking for a truce. But in addition to that, there is the potential for political costs, even though this is a war based on territory. So this is the work by current work by Getmansky and Weiss, which are both Israeli scholars. One of them is based in London, the other one in Harvard, and they use public opinion data as well as voting records before and after the war in order to engage and see in order to gauge how does the war itself, a territorial based war, affect the public support for the incumbent leaders and for the incumbent party in the Israeli government way back in the 1970s. And what they find is that even though the war was based on all these dynamics I've talked about, the important role the territory plays, the leader at that time has sustained a substantial drop in popularity, about 20%. We see here, so this is the expected, this is the size of the effects of the war on the level of support for different groups. So for the prime minister's support has dropped by about 20%. Support for the defense minister has dropped by about 10%. And support for Labor, which was the party at the time that was the incumbent party that has led the government, dropped by about 10%, while the main challenger, which was Likud, which is today's incumbent, had a 10% increase in its level of support. So as we see from that, there is substantial political cost for engaging in conflict, even though that conflict has revolved around the more salient issue of territory. They also find that a more general finding regarding fatalities in conflict, they found that localities such as cities and villages and big metropolitan areas that suffered from military fatalities has decreased their support for the incumbent party by about 9% and increased their support for the opposition party about 8%. So whether there were individuals that are living nearby a voter, that also has an effect on their level of support for this kind of conflict, despite the fact that this is a territorial conflict, which should have all the support that I've talked about. So this is just to give you some sense about the fact that even though a lot of this theory shows the importance that territory plays and how it's likely to generate support for aggressive action, military action, and even conflict over those issues, there are clear costs that leaders are liable to pay. And we'll talk about it even more today. So now I want to move from general discussion about territorial dispute, which I had on Monday, and dig a little bit deeper, trying to understand what makes those issues so important for us. Whether we're talking about the intangible value or the tangible value of territory, whether they are the cause for fighting over that, why is it so important for us? And to do that, we can begin with a couple of examples. So the two pictures you have here on the right are from an episode that took place in Israel in September of 1996. Israel has decided to open a tunnel which was mostly intended for tourists as a tourist attraction, and that tunnel was went very close, was going very close in the old city in Jerusalem, very close to the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is a holy site for Muslims, so this is a territory which Muslims view as very important for them. And Israel has decided to open that tunnel anyway, despite the protest by or the opposition by leaders of the Muslim community and the Muslim citizens. And that led to a 3-day clashes and violence between Israeli security authorities and Palestinian citizens, which ended with multiple casualties for both sides. So again, the idea is that a territory which some members of the population view as very, very important for them was seen as under risk, and that led to substantial violence. Similarly, territory of Kosovo, which used to be part of Yugoslavia before the war in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, it was always a part of discussions between different ethnic groups regarding control of the Kosovo, and the former Yugoslav president has tried to take control over that area in the 1990s, and that led to a large-scale violent conflict in the second half of the 1990s, and the Kosovo War, which was resolved or addressed primarily with the involvement of NATO and the United States. So again, territory which some members of the population in Yugoslavia, Serbia, saw as critical for them, led to a very, very costly war for many, many years. So in order to understand a little bit more this question that you see here on the top of the screen, why do we care so much about territory? I want to talk about one approach that explain that, and that's one of the papers that you had in your reading list for today, and that's the Johnson and Tuff paper. And they talk about an evolution-based approach to explain what makes territory such a crucial aspect that individuals are willing to die for, even if the value in some cases of that territory is not very clear. So why are we willing to die for territory? So the basics of the evolutionary approach revolve around the concept of territoriality, which is similar in some level to the concept of territoriality as it was introduced by Vasquez. But in the concept of this evolutionary approach, this represents a behavior that emphasizes the territory. And this is a behavior, a strategic behavior engaged by individuals. It's not unique to humans, and it's very common in the animal kingdom as well. And the prevalence of the territoriality behavior when it comes to having control over territory, and the prevalence of this idea over history suggests that this was viewed as a tested solution that solved the challenges of the environment. So having struggle over territory is a challenge that the environment represents for individuals as well as for animals, and they address that in a way by engaging this type of behavior revolves around territoriality. Now, this was developed because it is viewed as an effective strategy to ensure the survival of the species, whatever it is, individuals or whether it is humans or animals, and it allows them to have control over the territory to engage in those acts that are important for their survival, primarily resources and reproduction. The idea behind that is that territory by itself does not have a value. However, it represents a proxy through which humans, as well as members of the animal kingdom, secure their access to key resources they need for their own survival, protect them from competitors, and allows them to survive and to reproduce more. So that's the idea behind territoriality. Now, one of the core insights of this approach is that much of our behavior can fit, of course, as we said, to a rational process, right? But at the same time, that behavior is also influenced by psychological and physiological mechanisms that work like automatic, and we cannot switch them on and off. Our responses to some kind of scenarios can be automatic and not necessarily following a rational process. So that means that the tendency of individuals to fight over territory is part of our evolutionary process. It's not just a function of politics. It's not just that the president stands in Congress or stands outside the White House and declares that we have to fight for that territory because of A, B, and C. It's part of our innate evolutionary process that we're going to view securing a territory or fighting of a territory is a crucial part that we have to engage in. Now, still, we can fit that idea into a rational explanation, even if we follow the ideas. So let's think about the ideas that were introduced by Fear in his paper, which I talked about a few months ago. The idea of rational explanations to war. If individuals view territory as indivisible, especially in the sense that dividing the territory will destroy its value, then that means that the actors that are fighting or have a dispute over the territory cannot reach a settlement which will be mutually acceptable for both of them. So war, conflict over that territory, is a rational choice. As an example, we can think about, again, go back to the Middle East, and let's take Jerusalem again as an example. Jerusalem is a city which is holy to multiple religions, and many of those religious groups view it as indivisible in the sense of its religious value or the national value that cannot be broken down. So this is a map of the old city in Jerusalem. As you can see how it is broken down to different quarters. Each one of those religious groups have strong attachment to the city of Jerusalem, whether it is the Muslims and the Dome of the Rock, which is where this tunnel, which I talked about earlier, was opened. The Jewish people, which with the Wailing Wall is a very important issue. So despite the fact that in practice it may be possible to look at this territory as a divisible territory, those that have those strong beliefs see that territory as an indivisible one. We cannot share the territory of Jerusalem with others, and that may lead to conflict, which explains the fact that Jerusalem has been the center of conflicts between a lot of different groups of people throughout history, from religious arguments, whether it is national arguments, but that's part of the idea. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about looking at the concept of territory through the lenses of evolutionary theory or evolutionary approach that we have here from the Johnson and Tufts paper, and try to understand how that actually leads to an aggressive behavior or to conflict. So in nature, territory does not lead to violence by default. It's actually quite the opposite. The idea of holding a territory is mostly intended to prevent constant fighting, because again, we're thinking about it in the context of the animal kingdom, every animal keeps to their own territory and avoids the cost of fighting. So this lion group has that territory, and that lion group has that territory, and those elephant herd has their own territory. So instead of fighting over the same territory, they have their own areas, and that avoids the costs of fighting. So that's the default of that situation. However, there are conditions in which fighting over territory is more likely. For example, when there is what's called value asymmetry. The holders of the territory, the residents, possess higher value for that area compared to the intruders, because for the holders of the territory, it provides them with familiarity of its contents and help them to survive. So there's asymmetry in the value between the way that the residents view it, the way that the intruders view that. And that provides one explanations why, even if there are asymmetric relations in terms of the power between intruders and residents, the ones that hold the territory are more likely to win, even if they are weaker. Local residents also have the advantage because they know the territory, the layout of the land, which may help them in conflict. So despite those potential asymmetries when it comes to power, the fact that there's also asymmetries when it comes to value affects the potential outcome of conflict over territory. Now, those kinds of evolutionary dynamics can explain some of the concepts we talked about earlier when we talked about psychological mechanisms such as loss aversion and the status quo bias. For the status quo bias, it's based on the status quo, my ability to possess the land. If I'm going to potentially lose that land, there's going to be a substantial loss for me. So I'm going to fight even harder for that. That's part of the explanation here. However, at the same time, those that have very strong attachment to those lands, that may exacerbate their aggression against any type of intruders, and they may go and fight for that land even though in some cases it's not going to be necessary, because those strong bonds that they have to the land will make them relatively insensitive to the potential cost of fighting and the possibility that they may lose. If they're very weak from a power standpoint against the intruders, it is possible they're going to lose eventually. And there's a lot of nature films that you can watch that and see that the holders of the land sometimes do lose, but they will fight very hard for it. The second condition here is called economic defensibility and fits to the rational choice process. The idea is that fighting over territory is logical if the benefits will outweigh the cost. So it's a basic rational process. When we are focusing on the resources in the territory, which is important when thinking about it from an evolutionary standpoint, the focus is on the spatial distribution of those resources. And when all of them are relatively centered in the same area, then it makes sense to fight over it. If we have one territory with most of the resources in that same area, then it makes sense. It's more rational for different types of groups of animals or individuals to fight over it because we need those resources. That's part of our survival. Now, one of the things that Tufts and Johnson are using for the paper is that they use evolutionary game theory, which is a framework that helps us explain the behavior, the expected behavior of different individuals in their repeated interactions when it comes to, and it can be applied to a territorial disputes. So they suggest to follow the hawk-dove game, which describes the strategic settings in which there is a conflict or potential conflict between two individuals. One of them is a hawk, which is a more aggressive type, and it's going to attack until he's going to secure the victory or sustain substantial injury. And on the other hand, the other actor is represented by a dove, which will display a tendency to attack in order to take control of some area, but it's going to retreat if it's going to be attacked. So the dove will only display attack and retreat if attacked. The hawk is going to be aggressive and attack until victory. Now, overall, hawks, in most cases in those kinds of games, will fight to the end, which fits to what a lot of mammals tend to do, because of their survival depends on it. And again, according to the conditions of the game, when hawks invade to another territory, they will always win, and doves will always lose to hawks. Okay, so this is some of the basic conditions of the game. Now, if we want to use that to explain territorial disputes that also involve asymmetric conditions, those that's going to adopt the hawk strategy are more likely to be the holders of the territory, the residents, that they will fight to ensure that they are still winning and holding the land. And the doves are more likely to be the strategy adopted by the intruders. If each one of those actors are going to adopt this kind of strategy, it's going to reduce relatively the extent of cost for both of them and keep the advantage that we're still aware of with the residents, which are the incumbents holders of the territory. Okay, so that's another way to think about that. The solution of that, which means that residents adopt a hawk strategy and intruders adopt a dove strategy, offers for us a rational outcome in terms of fighting over territory, in which there may be a dispute over a certain area of territory, but those individuals or those two groups can avoid an all-out war. Now, this is one way to look at it from a rational standpoint, or to offer rational solutions to dispute over territory, especially if it's also involved kind of different types of asymmetries when it comes to power or value. But territorial aggression may be triggered by factors which go beyond the value of the land, the cost of the conflict, or the probability of victory. If both sides of the conflict perceive themselves to be the residents of the territory, then that's going to create certain expectations to each one of them. They will expect who's going to win the conflict with the other side because I'm the resident. Whether the other side is expected to back down. And all those kinds of expectations are going to be derived regardless of the size of my rival, as well as the strength of my rival. My rival may be a lot more powerful than I am, but I am the resident of the territory. So she or he has to back down. For example, about that, we can think about the difficulties that strong, powerful states have when they face conflicts against weaker rivals, trying to take control over the territory. For example, Afghanistan, which has been in almost a decade-long conflict with the Soviets back in 1970s, 1980s. They were much weaker from a power standpoint compared to the Soviets, but the Soviets were unable to take full control over that territory. And we can also look at that even in the context of the American involvement in Afghanistan. And the fact that from a rational standpoint, it doesn't make sense that the Afghans should still be able to have control over territory compared to the Americans, which are much more powerful. But we see that sometimes it goes, as we said, beyond a rational process. The conflict in Kashmir also fits that on some level. So all those examples are intended to show that sometimes there are factors beyond those rational processes that have an effect on the outcomes of territorial disputes. And that's going to be the next part that I'm going to talk about now. And that's the idea of the homeland, of I'm the resident of the territory. And that fits to what's called historical ownership as motivation for different types of behavior when it comes to territorial disputes. This is the work by Fang and Lee, and they want to study the argument that historical ownership of a territory have a strong effect on the likelihood of a dispute escalating into a full-blown conflict. They argue that perceptions of historical ownership of a territory are very powerful in creating views in which the territory is viewed as indivisible, therefore conflict is more likely. And in that sense, having the historical precedent in terms of I'm the owner of the territory from way back, it provides an opportunity as well as incentives for the leaders of those countries to make those kinds of claims. Because I'm going to make claim based on a territorial issue. If I have the historical precedent behind me, I'm more likely to generate more support for that. Now, the strength of the territorial argument has additional aspects to it. For once, it is possible that other states are going to view those kinds of arguments, those calls to have control over territory, as more legitimate when they're based on historical ownership, compared to having those kinds of arguments that are based on ethnic ties or having control over different types of resources. Other states are going to view my claim for that territory as more legitimate if I have historical ownership of that compared to I just have ethnic ties or I want to take control over the resources. Similarly, from a legal standpoint, Western perspective emphasizes property rights. So historical ownership suggests grievances towards those who took away a territory from its rightful owner. So again, if I have historical ownership arguments over this territory, I also have the legal background behind the legal support behind me in some level, and that's going to allow me to mobilize as well, of course, domestic support, but also even international support for my territorial claim. And third, when we're thinking about bonds to a territory over a long period of time, we're more likely to generate those strong emotional ties, which I've mentioned some of them also on Monday. So the argument here is that the claim of historical ownership increased the likelihood of having beliefs that the territory is indivisible, and therefore it should be viewed kind of as zero-sum outcome, and we only accept the outcome in which we have full control over this territory and its resources. In order to ensure that full control, we're more likely to support coercive types of policy options, such as military action, or economic sanctions. We have to have the full control of that territory because of the fact that this is historically ours. Now, another aspect that they add here, which amplifies that argument, is the idea of nationalism. Nationalism relates to strong identification of individuals with their nation and the interest of that nation in the international system overall. A threat on our national identity is likely to elicit even stronger emotional reactions because it represents for us a threat for our pride or for our self-esteem. So a threat to national identity that originates from losing historical territory can be even more powerful because it also connects to past experiences that for that nation that lost control over territory, which we have historical ownership on, the loss of territory was very unjust and humiliating. So in those kinds of conditions, compromise over that territory is non-acceptable, because individuals that suffer from those kinds of emotional reactions want to recover the area to overcome those kinds of unjust emotions. As an example, we can think about a lot of the territorial disputes that China is currently facing. A lot of them has historical and national identity links. For example, when it comes to the territorial disputes, when it comes to Tibet, around the boundaries of China, Southwest China and Tibet, as well as Taiwan, of course, and the current crisis that takes place, and the aggression and the kind of clashes, even though they're not direct clashes military standpoint, in most cases, in the South China Sea. So going back to the paper, Feng and Li want to test the argument about the importance of historical ownership using a survey experiment that they conduct in China. And the main variation that they do in terms of their experimental treatments is whether the territory has historical ownership arguments attached to it, and whether nationalism also plays a role. First of all, they find overall that there's a very high support for this zero-sum solution. So I need to have full control over territory. A territory which is related, and which also has a historical ownership claim attached to it, decreases the amount of support that respondents have for a compromise solution. So we see here different types of solutions here, and I want to focus on this one, showing the proportion of support for the solution. This is to compromise of the territory, and the circle line represents historical ownership, and the square represents no historical ownership. So we see that the level of support when there is historical ownership to a compromise solution is substantially lower, even providing kind of side payments as solution. Still, historical ownership is lower, even though the differences here are not significant. Sorry. They do not find support for their nationalism proposition. And they explain that by suggesting that their sample characteristics have overly nationalistic view in China, which is just a side point in this case. They also look in additional ways to address territorial disputes. And here we see on this side of the figure, we see the individuals that face a condition where they accept a compromise, so there's no historical ownership. And here, the territory is indivisible, so there is historical ownership. We see the extent of support for each one of them. Support for military action is substantially higher when there is indivisible territory, so there is historical ownership for that territory compared to compromise. Even for economic sanctions, we see both of the more aggressive types of actions. There's higher level of support when there is historical ownership of that territory. In arbitration, which is kind of a mediation solution of a territory, there's actually more support when the territory is not viewed as being historically owned. So that's one set of evidence that we see here regarding the important role that historical ownership claims have when it comes to territory, how it's actually more likely to increase the odds of conflict over territory or reduce the odds of preventing a conflict. Now, another angle of this territory argument relate to proximity, and that's the work by Tanaka also from a few years ago. He explains public views regarding different outcomes of territorial disputes, and his main argument is that spatial proximity to the territory at stakes will determine the incentives that the public has for different solutions, whether you accept a compromise or you do not accept a compromise. What he wants to test is whether potential variations within the public regarding those territorial disputes will affect the willingness to accept a compromise or to oppose a compromise, and the variations are mostly relied upon on the level of proximity those members of the public has from the territory at stake. So his argument links territory and support for different solutions to the proximity to that territory. One side of it says that those who live close by, so they are in close proximity to the territory, have more to lose from a conflict over it. So they will prioritize economic considerations and will favor a compromise, which in some level fit to the rational choice process. On the other hand, those who are distant from the territory in question are more likely to emphasize political consideration, ideological consideration, reputational aspect. They'll be less supportive of compromise. And finally, his third point is whenever a security threat is involved in those kinds of disputes, then the distance should have no effect. So if we're talking here about a territory which is in dispute because of security threat, then whether you live close by or live far away, it doesn't matter to your opinion. You're still going to have the same type of opinion regarding that territory. He tests those arguments with a survey ran in Japan regarding two areas that are contested islands Japan has, one with Korea, the other one with China. And again, the solutions that he offers to address those conflicts are either a compromise, which involves providing monetary compensation for the residents of that area, or a dispute. He finds, again, overall large opposition to compromise over territory. A compromise that is going to create reputational cost for Japan in this case also leads to a very strong opposition, regardless of the proximity measure. So this is maybe we can think about that as another intangible aspect of the territory or of the conflict, which proximity does not matter here. Now, proximity does matter when it comes to those that live close by to the territory in question, and they are promised to receive substantially high economic cost. Those individuals are more likely to accept the solution of a compromise. So those who are in close proximity, such as just like his argument was, as long as they are secured high economic benefits, they're accepting compromise. Again, fitting in some level to the rational choice solution. And additionally, he also had another subsample of the respondents. All of them are living in close proximity to those contested territories. And he finds in that subsample that the political arguments regarding the importance of that territory are not effective. And about a third of the respondents in that subsample are willing to accept a compromise over those islands if the economic benefits are kept substantially high. So again, this is actually a set of results which provide support for the rational thought process. And putting it first, in a way, it puts aside for a minute the security-based argument. And now we're going to shift back and put the security in center stage, because I want to talk about the tangible and intangible values of territory and how they drive support for conflict over territory. So overall, we know that territories have both tangible and intangible values, right? Tangible values include the resources in that territory, as well as the potential strategic advantage that they represent. And a conflict under those conditions may emerge when there's a failure between both actors to locate a bargaining space. And that can be part, if we're sticking with the rational choice process, commitment problems. I get to that in a second. We know the territories also have intangible values, whether it is history, I talked about that, ideological aspects, biological factors also affect the importance that territory plays. And if we're following a rational process in terms of what am I going to do with that territory? Am I going to fight for it? I'm going to concede control of the territory. Then if we're following a rational process, we're going to estimate the benefits, the net benefits when it comes to control versus concessions over the territory and decide what we want to do. However, still within this discussion of the framework of a rational process, one of the important aspects that needs to be added to the costs factor is the ability of my rival or my adversary to credibly commit to the agreement. So if I'm following this rational process and I decide that based on the cost and benefits calculus, it's better for me to reach some agreement with my rival and offer some concessions, I also have to consider what is the probability that that rival is not gonna is gonna renege on our agreement and try to take control over the full territory. That's part of a process of the rational process solution. So that's part of the tangible aspect out of it. So that's one side of it. Now the other side, as I said, is the intangible value, and that's how ideology or identity are very strong foundations for the intangible value that territory may represent. for different groups of individuals, the roots of their collective identity can be grounded in a shared land, in a shared homeland. This is an identity that is shaped during a very historic, long process that creates bonds, very strong bonds to the land, and those bonds are based on mythical, religious, or national meanings. Which means that for many ethnic groups around the world, their identity is defined by association with a particular territorial homeland, and they perceive that association as vital to their own existence. So my ethnic group is more likely to survive if I have control over land Z. If we don't have control over that land, we may not survive as a group. And that doesn't have to be just an ethnic group or ethnic link to the territory. It can be religious, it can be national. The idea behind that having this kind of a symbolic view of the territory, which emphasizes the intangible values of it, takes under consideration the potential costs of controlling it, but those costs are less powerful when I'm thinking about whether I want to fight over it and still maintain my control over it, or I'm going to accept backing down from it, or offering some concessions, or I have to fight in order to regain control of that territory. So that means that there are members within any public that emphasize the intangible value of the land, and they are willing to bear substantial material cost in order to retain the control of the territory, which again means that their intangible attachment to the land will be reflected in substantial support for maintaining control over territory, even when that control have clear adverse effects in the sense of their own lives. So they will sustain their support to control that territory, even though for each and even one of them, if we follow a rational process, when thinking about it from them individually, they pay some material cost in the sense of their economic situation or potential even risk for the national security. Even though those costs are there, they care a lot more about maintaining control of the territory because of its intangible value. So in order to test that argument and see whether it is true that some territories or for some individuals there are intangible values, which means they will ignore these rational processes when they decide whether to sustain the control over the land or not, we're looking at the work by Manikin and her associates, which tests this theory in the context of the West control over the West Bank and the views of Israeli citizens. This is a very good example of a contested territory, which for many members of the Israeli public has both tangible as well as very strong intangible value. And assessing this mechanism will allow us to understand some of the foundations of dispute over territories. So before I talk about their analysis, I will stop for today's attendance word. The attendance word today will be the word clouds. Clouds will be the attendance word for today. And let's jump back to their work. So they run survey experiments in Israel over a couple of years. And what they want to do, of course, is to assess both the tangible as well as the intangible aspects of the territory and see how that affects the views of the public regarding maintaining control over territory and the potential escalation of conflict. They use the conjoint design, which I've already introduced to you in previous lectures. You see here one example for how the information is displayed for the respondents. So they viewed two different policy options, potential ways that it's going to address the territory, so strengthen control over territory, withdraw from territories, potential aspects of security as a response to the territory action. For it will going to increase, they will decrease the attacks, the terrorist attacks. This policy will actually lead to increase in terrorism attacks. Again, reminding you, those are the factors that are being tested. And within the table, what the conjoint design allows us is to vary those values of those different factors and see the relative effect of each one of those factors on the final outcome, which is the different support for either one of those policy options. So let's see some of the results. Again, sorry about the small size of the tables, but this is one of the outcomes usually of using those kinds of designs. we see here, and we'll focus on this unconditional panel, which represents all respondents. We'll see the others in a second. And let's talk about, we talked about the tangible value, so the economic process. So we have here those two green dots here, and we have to look, of course, that the dotted line represents the zero. So everything larger than zero represents a positive effect, positive support for this kind of policy action, and everything on the negative side represents opposition to that. So if the policy action is going to create economic damages, then there's less support for it. If it's going to create benefits from an economic standpoint, there is support. Again, following the rational process. Similarly, on some level, from a security standpoint, if the terror attacks will decrease, then there is support for it. If it's going to increase, there's less support for it. But look what happens when we go to the territory point of it, which the policy in this case suggests that Israel will withdraw from the territories of the West Bank. And there's two aspects here. Some of them East Jerusalem or not, but in both cases, we see this negative effect. Less support. There's no support for concessions over the territories, regardless of all those more tangible aspects. This is the intangible value of the territory. Now, this is even more powerful when we're looking at this panel. This is the panel for right-wing voters. Right-wing voters in Israel are the ones who have much stronger intangible value for the territories, especially of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And their negative effect is very strong. On the other hand, those on the left-hand side of the political spectrum do not have strong intangible values to those lands. So you see they actually have a positive effect and support the withdrawal from the territories. Those in the center are also leaning towards rejection of it. Let's focus a little bit more about those that have the strong intangible value of the territory and see how that affects their opinion. This is, again, right-wing voters and their support, the level of support for different types of solutions. So keeping the territory, even though the conditions are bad, have a much weaker effect, or as not as powerful effect as keeping the territory but things are good. But overall, all of them wants to keep the territory and much less to give up the territory. Now, this is the center voters. Look at the difference between keeping the territory when conditions are bad, which is part of the intangible value argument, compared to keeping the territory when things are good. Much, much weaker effect here of value in terms of supporting that when the conditions around the intangible value of the territory change. Finally, we see here again, focusing on the right-wing voters, the ones that have the strongest intangible attachment to the land, and how likely they are to support concessions over those territories, assuming, and this is what we have here on the x-axis, those different bars, the percent of success that those concessions are going to offer in reducing terrorism. So essentially what it says, that if Israel is going to withdraw from those territories and offer concessions, that's going to reduce the success of reducing terrorism is going to be anywhere between, 0 to 100%. So let's focus about this 70-80 because the rest of the numbers are not that high and the 100% doesn't make a lot of sense. But we see that even if territorial concessions for those right-wing voters, I'm telling them, if we're going to provide those concessions, we're going to have 80% success in reducing terrorism, the level of support among those individuals is less than 10%, regardless of the tangible value the tangible aspect of conceding some of the control of the territories. I don't care about that. I care a lot more about keeping my control of the territory, even if that means that this thing is not secured, right? And we see that there is a substantial amount of them, this correlates to somewhere around 40-45%, that's going to never support concessions over the territory, regardless of the outcome when it comes to national security. And that's part of it. And that's just another evidence to show that in some cases, there are segments of the population that have very strong intangible links to a territory. They see a very strong, they have a very high intangible value for the territory, so they have a strong bond to that territory, and they're not likely to accept any kind of concession about it, which means they're also accepting the potential conflict of a territory, even though that conflict has clear potential costs. Okay, so if you want to read more, as always, I recommend those studies. Some of them are very, very recent. And I'll remind you once again, the third quiz, which focus on readings for next week revolving around international terrorism, is due Sunday night. So make sure you remember to do that. And with that, we have class on Friday, by the way, if you're interested in coming and talking about whatever it is that you want to talk about. And with that, I will sign off for today, and I will see you on Friday or next week. Bye, everyone.